The jungle roared with the sound of the storm. Thick clouds covered the sky and the rain fell in heavy sheets. Lightning split the darkness, followed by deep rolling thunder that shook the ground. The wind bent the trees and sent the smaller plants crashing to the forest floor. In the middle of this chaos, a small family of predator cubs ran through the underbrush, their fur wet and matted, their little claws slipping in the mud. The cubs had been playing near the river when the storm hit. One moment their world had been bright with sunlight, the next it was dark and frightening. The pack that had cared for them seemed far away, swallowed by the storm. The cubs huddled together, shivering, their small bodies trembling from fear and cold. They could hear distant roars and the sound of moving water, but nothing seemed familiar. Far, across the jungle in a small, sturdy shelter built from metal and wood, a human named Ethan prepared for the storm. He was a lone explorer, assigned to study this planet's wildlife, and he had lived here for almost a year. His base was simple but strong, built to withstand even the fiercest storms. He checked the sensors, made sure the doors were sealed, and placed extra food and water in a safe corner. As the storm hit its peak, Ethan noticed movement outside his base. At first he thought it might be the wind, twisting the branches against the metal walls. But then he saw shapes moving in the dim light, a pair of glowing eyes, small and round, watching from the edge of the jungle. He leaned closer, peering through the glass. There were 3 of them. Small, predator-like creatures, no bigger than a human child, with soft fur plastered to their bodies from the rain. Their eyes were wide, filled with fear and confusion. Ethan's heart softened instantly. He had studied predators on this planet, but he had never seen cubs alone in the storm. His instincts told him they needed help. He opened the reinforced door slowly, not wanting to scare them. "It's okay," he said softly. "Come here. You'll be safe." The cubs froze at the sound of his voice. They had never heard a human before. Their tiny ears twitched and their tails flicked nervously. But the rain was too strong, the cold too biting, and the shelter smelled warm and safe. Slowly, one cub stepped forward, then another, until all 3 were inside. Ethan crouched down, extending his hand. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. He fetched a small bowl of water and some nutrient paste he had for the research animals. The cubs sniffed cautiously, and one licked the paste hesitantly. Soon, all 3 were eating, their tails wagging, slightly. For the first time that day, the cubs felt warmth, not just from the shelter, but from the human who had saved them. They curled up near the heater, shivering, while Ethan watched them with a gentle smile. He knew they would not survive. The storm alone, and he felt a strange connection to these wild creatures. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, lightning flashing and thunder crashing. Ethan stayed nearby, talking softly to the cubs, making sure they were comfortable. They began to explore their temporary home, sniffing corners, examining equipment, and even trying to climb a small ladder. Ethan laughed quietly. "Careful," he said. "This is not your jungle yet." The cubs tried to mimic his movements, hopping, climbing, and pouncing in playful bursts. It was strange to see predators so small and innocent, so curious and trusting, especially after what they had likely faced in the wild. Ethan marveled at their intelligence. They were learning, adapting, and, most importantly, starting to trust him. Night fell, and the storm did not let up. Rain hammered the roof, and the wind shook the walls of the shelter. Ethan set up soft mats and blankets in a corner, and the cubs huddled together on them. He sat nearby, keeping watch. He knew that the cubs' instincts were strong. They were predators even at this age, but for now they were just small, scared creatures who needed protection. As the night deepened, something remarkable happened. The cubs began to curl around Ethan's legs, pressing their wet bodies against him for warmth. Their little claws gently kneaded at his clothing, and their eyes slowly closed. Ethan felt a deep sense of satisfaction and responsibility. He had never imagined that he would care for alien predators as if they were his own. Yet a question lingered in his mind. Where was their pack? Would they come looking for the cubs? And if they did, would the cubs leave? Or would they choose to stay? With him? Ethan could only hope that he had done enough to earn their trust at least for the night. Outside, the storm continued to howl, but inside the shelter, there was calm. 3 tiny predator cubs slept safely, and 1 human sat quietly, watching over them. Bonds had begun to form in the unlikeliest of ways. It was a beginning, fragile yet strong, and neither human nor cub could yet imagine how this night would change their lives. The first part of their story had begun, not with a roar or a chase, but with trust, warmth, and the simple act of offering shelter in a storm. Outside, the jungle waited wild and untamed, but inside, a small family had already begun to form, and deep down, even the cubs sensed it. This human was different. He was not a threat. He was a protector. The storm would not last forever, but the bond that had begun in its fury would not be easily broken. The storm had finally passed by morning, leaving the jungle soaked and dripping. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with humidity and the smell of wet earth. Sunlight peeked through the heavy clouds, reflecting off the puddles that covered the ground. Outside, the world looked calm, but inside the small shelter, life was beginning to stir in an unusual way. The 3 predator cubs were awake early. Their fur was damp and their eyes gleamed with curiosity. They moved cautiously at first, sniffing the walls, the floor, and the strange human who had sheltered them through the night. Ethan was already awake, preparing breakfast. He had learned the cubs' preferences from last night. Some ate slowly, some cautiously, but all were hungry. "Good morning," Ethan said softly. "Time to eat." He placed bowls of nutrient paste and water on the floor. The cubs approached slowly. One pawed at the bowl, then licked it. Another nudged Ethan's hand with its nose, as if testing if he was friendly. The third circled the room, eyes wide, ears alert. Ethan watched carefully, making sure they felt safe. "You're okay," he whispered. "Nothing will hurt you here." Slowly, the cubs began to eat, their trust growing with each cautious bite. After breakfast, Ethan decided to let them explore more of the shelter. The cubs were energetic, jumping, climbing, and testing their small claws on corners and furniture. One tried to climb a chair but slipped. Ethan caught it gently. "Careful, little one," he said. "You'll get used to it." The cubs tilted their heads and looked at him, almost as if they understood. Ethan realized something remarkable. These cubs were learning quickly, not just physically but mentally. Their intelligence was beyond what he had expected. Even at this young age, they were curious, observant, and capable of recognizing kindness. He spent the morning playing simple games with them. He would roll a small ball across the floor and the cubs would chase it, pouncing and batting it with their paws. One cub learned faster than the others, catching the ball and bringing it back. Ethan laughed, impressed. "Good job," he said. The cub seemed proud, tail flicking happily. Soon the cubs began to follow Ethan wherever he went. When he went to fetch tools or check sensors, they padded behind him silently, careful not to disturb anything. Ethan found this behavior fascinating. They were wild predators, but they were learning to trust a human completely. By midday, Ethan decided to take a small break. He sat on the floor and the cubs came closer, sniffing, nuzzling, and brushing against him. One laid its small head on his lap, eyes half closed. Ethan felt a warmth he had never experienced before. These creatures, born to survive in the harsh jungle, were showing affection. He noticed something else too. Each cub had a different personality. One was cautious and thoughtful, always sniffing before acting. Another was playful and brave, climbing anything it could reach. The third was gentle, almost shy, but observant and clever. Understanding these differences helped Ethan bond with them more deeply. Later, Ethan took them outside for a short walk, around the shelter. The jungle had been washed clean by the storm. The ground was muddy, the trees dripping, and the air smelled fresh. The cubs were hesitant at first, sticking close to Ethan, but slowly they began to explore. They sniffed the wet grass, leapt over puddles, and investigated the strange plants nearby. Ethan guided them gently, showing safe paths and pointing out dangers. Stay close, he said. Don't go too far. They seemed to understand, staying near him, occasionally glancing at him for reassurance. As the day went on, Ethan taught them simple commands. Sit, stay, and come. At first, the cubs were confused, tilting their heads and looking at him. But with patience and a gentle hand or small reward, they began to respond. One cub sat perfectly when asked, earning a soft pat on the head. Another came running when called, tail wagging. Ethan smiled. Teaching them was not just about control, it was about communication. These cubs were learning to understand him, and he was learning to understand them. Each small success built trust, making the bond stronger. By evening, the cubs were exhausted. They had explored, played, and learned much in a single day. Ethan prepared a small meal for them and settled down in the corner of the shelter. The cubs curled up next to him, their small bodies warm and content. One even rested its head on his arm, a sign of trust that touched him deeply. He watched the sky through the shelter's window. The storm clouds had mostly disappeared, leaving a faint orange glow from the setting sun. Outside, the jungle seemed peaceful again, but Ethan knew it could be dangerous. Wild predators roamed, and the cubs' pack might be searching for them. Yet inside, they were safe, for now. Ethan reflected on the day. He had started as a caretaker, simply providing shelter during a storm. But now, he felt a connection that went deeper. These cubs were not just survivors. They were intelligent, emotional beings capable of forming bonds with a human, and he realized something important. Kindness and patience could bridge even the greatest gaps between species. As night fell, the cubs slept soundly beside him, exhausted from play and exploration. Ethan stayed awake a little longer, keeping watch. He knew this was only the beginning. Their trust had been earned, but many challenges still lay ahead. The cubs' instincts were strong, and the jungle was full of danger, yet he felt ready. In the quiet of the shelter, with the cubs breathing softly next to him, Ethan understood one simple truth. Sometimes the wildest creatures only needed one person to show them care, one person to protect them, one person to trust. And in return, they gave loyalty, affection, and companionship beyond what words could describe. This was the start of something extraordinary. A human and 3 predator cubs, learning to understand each other, discovering that trust could survive even in a world as wild and dangerous as this jungle. The bond had begun, and it was stronger than either species could have imagined. The sun rose slowly over the jungle, casting golden light through the thick canopy. The storm had passed completely, but the jungle was still wet and slippery. Ethan stepped outside, carrying bowls of food for the cubs. They had slept deeply, through the night, curled around each other in a small pile of warmth and safety. The cubs greeted him eagerly, tails flicking, eyes bright. They had grown comfortable inside the shelter, but the wild instincts in their eyes reminded Ethan that these were still predator cubs, small but clever. He placed the food on the ground, stepping back to let them eat without pressure. After breakfast, Ethan decided to teach them more about survival outside the shelter. The jungle was unpredictable, even after a storm. Flooded paths, fallen trees, and slippery rocks created dangers for the cubs. He wanted to make sure they could move safely. "Follow me," Ethan said gently. "Stay close." The cubs padded after him, their small paws leaving prints in the wet mud. Ethan pointed out hidden dangers, thin branches that could snap, holes in the ground, and areas where the water had risen dangerously. The cubs watched closely, mimicking his movements. When Ethan climbed over a fallen log, one cub hesitated, but with a soft word and gesture it followed him carefully. As they walked, Ethan noticed signs of other predators. Paw prints, broken branches, and distant growls suggested the cubs' pack was not far. He felt a twinge of worry. He knew the cubs would eventually be drawn back to their pack, but he also understood the importance of the trust they had built with him. "Don't worry," he whispered, more to himself than to the cubs. "We'll stay safe." Suddenly, a rustling in the bushes caught their attention. Ethan froze. The cubs crouched low, ears twitching. A medium-sized predator, part of the cubs' pack, emerged from the undergrowth. It stared at them, teeth bared slightly, testing. The cubs looked to Ethan, unsure of what to do. Ethan stayed calm, keeping his hands visible but still. "Easy," he said softly. "We don't want trouble." The pack member sniffed the air, assessing the situation. It glanced at the cubs, then back at Ethan. Finally, it turned and disappeared into the jungle, leaving the cubs trembling but unharmed. Ethan exhaled slowly. That had been close. The cubs seemed to understand something important. They stayed closer to him now, moving, as a small unit under his guidance. It was strange for Ethan to see predator instincts align with human commands, but he felt proud. They were learning not only to trust him, but also to navigate danger with him. Throughout the day, Ethan took the cubs to various areas around the shelter, showing them safe spots to rest, hidden streams for water, and areas where small prey could be found. The cubs were curious, playful, and surprisingly observant. They began to follow his lead, crouching, leaping, and sniffing exactly as he showed them. At one point, a small predator appeared near a stream where the cubs were drinking. Ethan watched as the cubs instinctively crouched and growled, protecting their space. He realized they were beginning to act not only as learners but as guardians, understanding the need to protect what they had. "Good job," Ethan said softly, kneeling to praise them. One cub rubbed its head against his hand, another circled him playfully, and the third watched carefully, alert but calm. By evening, Ethan noticed that the cubs had changed subtly. Their confidence had grown. They were no longer just frightened, curious creatures. They were adapting to his guidance and beginning to understand teamwork. The bond they shared with him had strengthened their instincts, making them more capable than they had been alone. As night fell, Ethan prepared another safe area for them in the shelter. He placed blankets and soft mats in a corner, making it comfortable for rest. The cubs curled up together, their small bodies pressed close. Ethan sat nearby, keeping watch, feeling a strange mix of responsibility and pride. He thought about the challenges that lay ahead. The jungle was still full of dangers, storms, predators, and natural hazards. But with patience, teaching, and care, he could guide the cubs, help them survive, and maybe even help them make choices beyond instinct alone. The cubs, for their part, were changing too. They had begun to recognize Ethan as a protector, a teacher, and a companion. They followed his commands, watched his movements, and seemed to understand the safety he provided. Their instincts were strong, but they were learning something new: trust. That night, as the moonlight filtered through the shelter's windows, Ethan and the cubs rested together. The soft sounds of breathing and the occasional twitch of a tail were comforting. Ethan knew that the jungle was unpredictable, but inside the shelter, they had built a small world of safety and learning. The cubs had survived the storm, but now survival meant something more. It meant learning, adapting, and forming a connection that went beyond instinct. They had started to see Ethan as part of their world, a strange, tall creature who did not threaten them, who fed them, guided them, and protected them. Ethan smiled quietly as he watched them sleep. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more lessons, and more opportunities for trust. He knew the jungle would test them, but he also knew the bond they had formed could help them face anything. Outside, the jungle was dark and alive, full of sounds and movements. Inside, a human and 3 predator cubs had begun to create a small world of safety, learning, and cooperation. Each had learned from the other, and each had grown a little stronger, a little braver. The night was quiet, but the sense of connection was strong. The cubs had begun to see the human not as a stranger, but as someone they could rely on. And Ethan had begun to see them not just as wild creatures, but as companions, learners, and protectors in their own right. This was no longer just a story of survival. It was a story of trust, adaptation, and the extraordinary bond that could form between species when patience, care, and understanding guided every action. The jungle waited outside, wild and untamed, but inside, lessons had been learned, and Trust had been earned, and that trust would shape the days to come. The jungle was alive with sounds the next morning. Birds called to each other from high in the canopy. Insects buzzed near the ground, and small streams gurgled from the hills. Ethan stepped outside the shelter, carrying bowls of food for the cubs. Their fur had dried slightly from the storm, though they still carried the damp smell of the jungle. The cubs ran to him eagerly, tails flicking and little claws clicking against the ground. They had grown confident in the last few days, exploring the shelter, learning commands and following Ethan's lead. But the jungle beyond the shelter was a world of unknowns, full of wonders and dangers alike. Today, Ethan decided to take them on a short exploration. "Stay close," he said. "We're going to see something amazing." The cubs padded behind him, watching every step. Ethan led them along a safe path he had discovered over the past months, twisting routes, gentle slopes, and areas where the ground was solid. Occasionally, a cub would sniff the air, twitching its ears, or leap over a small puddle, showing both curiosity and caution. Soon they arrived at a hidden grove, untouched by storms. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting golden light over a small pond. But what made the grove truly extraordinary were the glowing plants growing along the edges. Their leaves shimmered softly in blues, greens, and purples, pulsating slightly, as if alive. Ethan had seen many strange plants on the planet, but these were unique, almost magical. The cubs approached cautiously, sniffing the glowing leaves. One reached out a paw, touching a leaf gently. The leaf responded, vibrating slightly under the touch. The cub yipped in surprise and pulled back, then tried again, more carefully. Ethan laughed softly. "They're safe," he said. "But fascinating, aren't they?" The cubs began to explore the grove fully, weaving between the glowing plants, sniffing, pawing, and even playfully chasing each other around the small pond. Their curiosity seemed endless, and Ethan watched, amazed at their intelligence. They were learning not only about the world but also about how to interact with it safely. As the cubs played, Ethan noticed patterns in the plants. Some reacted to touch, others seemed to respond to movement. The cubs, with their sharp senses, picked up on these differences quickly. One clever cub tapped a plant repeatedly, and it opened slightly, revealing a small pool of clear water beneath. The cub lapped it up happily, nudging Ethan to try it too. "This is incredible," Ethan whispered, crouching to observe. He realized the cubs were not just playful, they were problem solvers. They could learn, adapt, and even help him discover things he might have missed. It was an extraordinary collaboration, a partnership between human and alien predator. The grove also offered small creatures that could serve as food if needed. Ethan allowed the cubs to explore this aspect carefully. One cub caught a small frog and held it gently, unsure of what to do. Ethan gently guided it. "You can watch, learn, but don't hurt it," he said. The cub seemed to understand, releasing the frog unharmed. The day passed in a rhythm of discovery and learning. Ethan watched as the cubs began to recognize patterns, understand safety, and interact with the jungle in ways they never had before. The glowing plants fascinated them most. They would paw, sniff, and even nuzzle the leaves, their tails flicking in delight. During a quiet moment near the pond, Ethan sat on a rock, observing the cubs. He realized something remarkable. They had begun to trust him fully, not safety but for guidance, for the morning air was thick with tension. Ethan noticed it immediately as he stepped outside the shelter. The jungle, usually alive with small sounds and movement, was unusually quiet. The birds were silent, and even the rustle of leaves seemed muted. The cubs, sensing it too, pressed close to him, ears twitching, tails low. Ethan's heart sank as he saw movement through the trees. Shadows shifted and grew larger. He recognized the shapes instantly. The cubs' pack had arrived. Larger, predators, powerful and sleek, moved with purpose. Their eyes glimmered as they scanned the area, sniffing the air. Their leader, a large adult predator with dark fur and a commanding presence, stepped forward first. The cubs froze, glancing toward their pack. They had been taught by nature to obey, to return, to follow the pack's commands. Yet here they were in Ethan's care, safe and protected, and something had changed in them. They hesitated. Ethan stepped forward slowly, hands visible, voice calm but firm. "Stay calm," he said softly. "Everything is okay." The pack approached cautiously. Their eyes focused on the cubs, then flicked to Ethan. The leader growled low, a warning, testing the human. Ethan remained still, letting the cubs' instincts guide the situation, showing no aggression. He trusted the bond they had built over the past days. One cub stepped forward slightly, ears tilted back. Another stayed close to Ethan's side, tail flicking nervously. The third looked between the pack and the human, uncertain. Ethan knelt slightly, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "You don't have to choose," he whispered, though he knew they must. "But I trust you." The pack leader sniffed the air, growling softly. It nudged one cub gently in an attempt to assert control. The cub hesitated, then shook its head and stayed near Ethan. The leader growled louder, signaling dominance. The cub shivered but did not move. Ethan took a deep breath. He knew the cub's instincts were strong, but the bond they shared with him was stronger. He needed to show respect to the pack without forcing conflict. Slowly, he extended a hand, not toward the pack, but toward the cubs, a gesture of trust and guidance. The cubs responded. They pressed closer, tails brushing Ethan's arms, leaning on him. The pack growled, circling, observing. It was clear the leader understood that these cubs were making a choice. They were no longer just members of a wild pack. They had experienced safety, care, and companionship with the human. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. The cubs looked at Ethan, then at their pack, then back again. Finally, one small cub growled softly. Not a threat, but a declaration. The other two joined in, a low, steady sound that echoed through the clearing. The pack leader paused, ears twitching, then stepped back. The other members followed. Ethan exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. The cubs had made their choice. They would stay. Their instincts still guided them, but trust and affection had guided them even further. They had chosen a new kind of family. After the confrontation, Ethan guided the cubs back to the shelter. They moved together, alert but calm. He glanced back toward the jungle, watching the pack retreat. The adult predators did not seem angry. Instead, there was a recognition, a respect for the choice the cubs had made. Ethan realized that in the wild, even predator instincts could adapt when loyalty and trust were strong. Back at the shelter, Ethan fed the cubs and allowed them to rest. They were tired, both physically and emotionally. The confrontation had been intense, a test of courage and loyalty. The cubs curled up near him, safe once more, but changed. They had faced their past, confronted instinct, and chosen to stay, in a world different from the one they had known. Ethan sat quietly, observing them. Each cub had grown in confidence, bravery, and understanding. They were learning not only about the jungle, but also about trust, choices, and the bonds that could exist between species. He realized that he had not just protected them. They had changed him as well. As the day passed, Ethan introduced small games and exercises to reinforce trust. He showed them how to climb safely, how to watch for danger, and even how to help him maintain the shelter. The cubs adapted quickly, their intelligence remarkable. One even helped move a small fallen branch to clear a path. Another nudged a bowl toward Ethan when he was busy, showing understanding and empathy. By evening, the cubs were exhausted but content. They had made a life-altering choice, one that would define their future. Ethan prepared mats and blankets in the shelter's corner. The cubs curled up, heads resting on each other, tails wrapped around their small bodies. One laid its head on Ethan's lap, a quiet gesture of trust and affection. Ethan reflected on the day. The jungle was full of dangers, predators, and challenges, yet inside this small shelter, a new family had formed. It was a family built on choice, understanding, and respect. The cubs had learned that strength was not just in claws or instincts, but in trust, loyalty, and companionship. Night fell and the shelter was calm. Outside, the jungle remained alive, distant sounds of wildlife echoing in the darkness. But inside, human and cubs rested together, a bond stronger than any storm or instinct could break. Ethan knew there would be challenges ahead, storms, predators, and perhaps even encounters with other humans, but he also knew they were ready. Together they were stronger. The cubs had chosen him, not out of fear but out of trust. And in return, Ethan had chosen them, not as pets or experiment, but as companions, learners, and friends. It was a choice that carried meaning, shaping their days ahead. In the quiet of the night, Ethan looked at the sleeping cubs and whispered softly, "We'll face everything together. You're safe, and I'll protect you. Always." The cubs shifted in their sleep, tiny paws brushing his arms as if responding. They had made a choice, and it was a choice that would not be forgotten. The bond between them had survived storms, instincts, and challenges, proving that trust and loyalty could bridge even the widest gap between species. Tomorrow would bring more adventures, more lessons, and perhaps more dangers. But for tonight, they were together, safe and united, and that, Ethan knew, was more important than anything else. The jungle waited outside, wild and untamed, but inside the shelter, 3 predator cubs and a human had begun a life together, a life built on trust, courage, and the extraordinary power of choice. The morning sunlight filtered through the jungle canopy, painting the shelter in soft gold. Ethan stepped outside, carrying bowls of food for the cubs. They were awake already, stretching their small bodies, tails flicking, and eyes gleaming with curiosity. The events of the past days had changed them. They were no longer frightened, and helpless but confident, clever and attentive. The cubs ran to him eagerly, pressing close, sniffing the bowls before eating. Ethan smiled, watching their small, precise movements. Each cub had its own personality, one cautious and thoughtful, one playful and bold, and one gentle but clever. Their bond with him had grown stronger than he had ever imagined. They trusted him, and he trusted them. After breakfast, Ethan decided to take them for a walk deeper into the jungle. He wanted them to explore safely, learn more, and continue strengthening the skills that would help them thrive. The cubs followed closely, listening to his instructions, and occasionally stopping to investigate small wonders. Colorful plants, tiny insects, and strange markings in the soil. As they moved through the jungle, the cubs displayed their intelligence and growing confidence. They leapt over puddles, avoided weak branches, and even helped Ethan navigate around fallen trees. Their instincts were still strong, but now they were paired with awareness, trust, and understanding. At one point, the cubs led Ethan to a hidden clearing. Sunlight poured through the trees, illuminating a small grove of glowing plants, the same kind they had discovered days ago. The cubs approached it excitedly, sniffing, pawing, and exploring. One of them nudged Ethan as if to say, "Look, this is ours too." Ethan knelt, observing the plants and the cubs' interaction. Their curiosity, combined with their instincts, allowed them to notice things he might have missed. "This is amazing," Ethan said softly. "You're showing me a new world." The cubs chirped and yipped happily, clearly enjoying the interaction. Ethan realized something profound. They were teaching him as much as he was teaching them. The bond between human and predator cubs was no longer one-sided. It was a partnership. When the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Ethan guided the cubs back to the shelter. The jungle had calmed after the day's activity, and the path home was familiar. The cubs moved with confidence, occasionally glancing at Ethan to make sure he was nearby. They had learned to trust him completely, and he had learned to trust them. Back at the shelter, Ethan prepared a small area for the cubs to rest. Soft mats, blankets, and a warm corner made it comfortable. The cubs curled up together, heads resting on each other, tails wrapped around their bodies. One even laid its head on Ethan's lap, a quiet gesture of loyalty and affection. As night fell, the jungle outside was alive with its usual sounds, but inside the shelter, peace had settled. Ethan sat quietly watching the cubs. He reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from a violent storm that had separated them from their pack, to the trust and bond that had grown stronger with every day. He thought of the pack, the confrontation and the choice the cubs had made. They had faced instinct, loyalty to their family and fear, and they had chosen him. It was a choice that,